I'm sorry, I'm a little late. Hope your week is going well. This week, of course, we are finishing the first of the five Chumashim. We are finishing the book of Breitowitz. And really, the single largest story in the book of Breitowitz is, of course, the story of Yosef and his brothers. It takes up three whole Parshiot and part of a fourth Parsha. So it's worthwhile to reflect a little bit on the ultimate meaning of this story. You know, there are certain questions when you learn Chumash. You know, you ask the question in fifth grade and you ask the question when you're 50 and 60, 70, 80, meaning certain questions, frankly, just never get resolved. We ponder them our entire lives and we don't come to a final resolution. But of course, that's part of the idea of learning Torah. As the t-shirt saying says, it's not the destination, it's the journey. And very, very often, part of being a Jew means you never really come to final answers. Everybody asks, how could Yosef's brothers sell Yosef? And I'll give you an answer, but you'll still say, next year you'll ask the same question. I'll ask the same question. And how could Yosef behave that way to his brothers? So in spite of knowing ahead of time that almost anything we say is going to leave it as kind of a takeaway question, how could it happen? But we'll endeavor to talk a little bit about the perspective. But first I want to deal with an unrelated, very beautiful thought that Rav Gedalia Shor was a great Rosh Yeshiva who combined what we call Litvisha learning and Hasidic warmth, an unusual combination a little bit, offered. You know, there's a pasuk in the prophet Amos that talks about the Messianic era, and it says, Hine yamim ba'im, behold, days are coming, v'nigash choresh el kotzer, that the plower will meet up with the harvester, meaning the simple meaning of the verse is the harvest will be so abundant that they will still be harvesting last summer's crop by the time the rainy season comes, and they're going to have to plow. Nigash choresh b'kotzer. But there's a medrash that says the following, symbolic language. Choresh is a reference to Yehudah, who is called a plower. Kotzer is a reference to Yosef, who is called a harvester. And note the word, this is actually from last week's Parsha, note the vanigash, they will come near. That's the same word, vayigash elav Yehudah. And therefore Amos is alluding to the famous pivotal meeting between Yosef and Yehudah. Now, number one, if he's referring to the Messianic era, why is he connecting it to the meeting of Yosef and Yehudah? And number two, why would Yehudah get the appellation of Choresh, the plower, and Yosef gets the designation of the harvester? So Rav Gedalia Shor brings in the name of the Avnei Nezer. Now the Avnei Nezer was the Sachatshova Rebbe who died at the beginning of the 20th century. He was the son-in-law of the very enigmatic Kutzker Rebbe, which is that deserves a whole share by itself. But the Sachatshova Rebbe also was a great, great posek, and he wrote an exceptionally accepted book on the laws of Shabbos, the Eglei Tal. So one could imagine that his mindset is he's very attuned. Remember, Choresh and Kotzer are two of the 39 malachos of Shabbos. So he wants to use the halachic definition of those malachos to explain why Yehudah is the Choresh and Yosef is the Kotzer. The definition of Choresh, plowing, in terms of Shabbos, is not only using a plow, but it's softening up the land to make it able to receive a seed. Lirapuye ara is the language of the Gemara, softening up the land. The definition of kotzer is oker davar migidulo. You uproot something from its source of growth. Now, symbolically, mud, dirt, ground refers to chumriot, gashmi, physicality, materialism, attachment to lust. Yosef is called a kotzer because when Yosef is subjected to temptation, sexual temptation, he simply just says, like Nancy Reagan used to say, just says no. He's oker davar migidulo. He uproots himself from chumriyot, from tava, and the like. When Yehuda is subject to being tempted by a prostitute, well, a woman he thought was a prostitute, who happened to be his daughter-in-law, but he didn't know that, Tamar, Yehuda succumbs. Yehuda fails. Yehuda is nichshal. But Yehuda teaches us how to do tshuva. Yehuda teaches us how to accept responsibility. When Tamar was not going to reveal with whom she was pregnant, because, as the Gemara says, it is better to go to a fiery death than to humiliate someone publicly, and all she said was by indirection, the man that gave me this money belt and this staff. And Yehuda said, Satka mimeni, she is more righteous than I. So the Avnei Nezer then goes on and makes a very fundamental observation. It's interesting that the permanent malchut of Am Yisrael was given to Shevet Yehuda, via David HaMelech and Mashiach. The Mashiach will come from David HaMelech. Now, quite logically, one might have thought Yosef was very qualified for the role. Number one, Yosef had the executive experience in Mitzrayim. And number two, Yosef had the spiritual experience of really being subject to temptations at all extremes. Yosef really represents all of the polar extreme experiences a Jew can have in the exile. He was a lowly slave. He was a prisoner who languished in jail. And at the same time, he had the nisayon of wealth and honor and prestige and kavod. And Yosef remained faithful to Hashem in all of those circumstances. So why was Yosef not chosen to be the ultimate king? And the answer is because a king is a role model. A king is a person we look to for how to live our own lives. In an ideal sense, granted, there were plenty of bad kings in the Tanakh. We're talking about the ideal of a melech. And sometimes the person who is so perfect that he does not succumb to temptation is not necessarily the person from whom I can learn. But I learn from people who make mistakes, people who fail, people who are tempted, people who go through the same issues that I go through, and therefore I can grow from them. So, as a result, therefore, the Malchut was given to Yehuda and not to Yosef. Okay, so that's a general point of the Choresh and the Kotzer. But now, let's get back to try to just see a basic pshat, just a basic explanation of the tribe's behavior and Yosef's behavior. Now, the basic explanation, let's first start with the brothers. How could the brothers, number one, they wanted to kill Yosef, first of all. They wanted to kill him. That got modified. Okay, we're not going to kill him. We will just sell him into slavery. How could that be? I mean, I always say that, people in Or Sameach, one of the issues that is always discussed in the philosophy classes is what types of proofs do you have that the Torah is a divine document of revelation? Maybe it was written by human beings. So I'm not going to get into those philosophical arguments. I just want to give you a layman's proof. If we would be writing our own history, we would not put in any of these stories there. We would not put in, because the truth of the matter is, we would whitewash our history. We wouldn't talk about Yaakov taking the blessings from Esav. We wouldn't talk about the brothers selling Yosef.
What would we write about?
Well, it would be a much more boring story, so to speak. But to me, one of the biggest proofs that it comes from God is because we would never write our history that particular way. So, there is a thought that is offered by the Saporno. Rabbi Ovadia Saporno was one of the great Rishonim. He lived in the Italian Renaissance. And the Saporno makes the following argument. The brothers saw a certain pattern that was being developed here. When there was Avraham, there was the Yitzchak son and the Ishmael son. The Ishmael son was banished. and the covenant was made with Yitzchak. Yitzchak had a Yaakov and an Esav, and Yaakov gets the blessings, and Esav also gets banished to Mount Seir, or goes to Mount Seir, and the divine covenant is carried through with Yaakov. Now they see a potential repetition of that pattern, because on one hand, Yaakov loves Rachel more than Leah, whatever that means, to be sure, and in addition to that, the Yosef is bringing lashon hara about various sins that the brothers may be doing. So the brothers see that Yosef is creating a wedge. This is the Seporno that will be marchik them from Yaakov. Now keep in mind, this is not simply a matter of 10 brothers being alienated from their father. This affects their whole future, their whole destiny, their whole purpose in the world, to create a holy nation that will accept eventually Hashem's Torah, that will be a beacon of godliness in the world. And therefore they considered Yosef worse than someone that is threatening their physical lives. They considered Yosef a rodef, someone that is destroying their whole spiritual existence. And Chazal actually say, Gadol hamachtiyo yoter min hargo. He who causes me to sin, he who alienates me from God, is even worse than one who kills me physically. And therefore, they came to the judgment that Yosef was a rodef who could even be killed. But then, obviously, if we could disable him by less than killing him, such as selling him into slavery, we have to do that. Because again, the law of rodef is back in the news, as you know. I mean, that was the conviction of the chayal for manslaughter for shooting the terrorist. And halachically, of course, it's obvious that you can kill a terrorist who is in the middle of committing terrorist acts because he is a rodef. The question becomes, once the terrorist is immobilized. Now again, the Chayal's version of the story, and I have no idea, is that he thought the person had, there was a weapon within reach, and therefore he was still a clear and present danger. If that would be the case, the law of rodef would continue to apply. If, on the other hand, the person was no longer capable of a terrorist action, then at that point he could only be punished for his past actions, and that would require the decision of a Beit Din or a court. An individual cannot go around punishing even murderers for the crimes that they committed. But again, that actually wouldn't apply so much today. So it is a very difficult question, meaning to say, under halacha, if indeed the terrorist was immobilized, he would no longer have a shame of a chodef. But what do you do? On the other hand, I guess from on the one hand, this does have an impact on combat morale, and there may be a little bit of a feeling that the country or the court system is not supporting the bravery of the chayalim. So maybe a way out, although it's an illogical way out, but it might be a de facto way out, is convict the guy, as was done, and then get him a pardon, which might be done as well. And that way, we've expressed what the proper legal and even halachic standard is, but then we understand, under the stress of the moment, individuals cannot always be fully responsible for the decisions that they make. In other words, there's a difference between condemning the act and condemning the actor, who, we really can't put ourselves in the shoes of the stress of the moment and the like. But okay, be it as it may, though, going back to this, the Seporno actually says that the brothers considered Yosef to be a chodef. Now, halachically, this is a very, very problematical assertion, halachically, because even though it's true that Chazal say, he who causes me to sin is worse than the person who kills me, as far as I know, if somebody is trying to entice me away from Torah, I'm not allowed to take out my gun and kill him. I mean, we don't treat that person as a rodef formally. And of course, it's also very clear, is it not, that in spite of all of this justification, the sale of Yosef is a very, very grievous sin. that kind of left an indelible mark on the Jewish people. Both on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av, we read a piyut, we read a poem about the 10 martyrs who were killed during the Second Temple period, including Rabbi Akiva, or actually, either during the temple or after the temple. And by the way, contrary to what you might think, the 10 martyrs were not killed at the same time, because just looking at their names, it spans around 150 years. Some of the martyrs were during the Beit HaMikdash, and some, like Rabbi Akiva, was after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is a number of years later. But poetically, it was woven as if they were all killed at the same time. But if you remember the narrative, the Tisha B'Av one is different than the Yom Kippur one. Actually, it's some different names. It's not the same story, but at least the Yom Kippur version, which is a bit more detailed, Mincha Musavot Yom Kippur, Asar Harugei Malchus, it is recorded that the 10 martyrs were put to death as a heavenly atonement for the 10 tribes who sold Yosef. As the Torah says, if you kidnap a person and you sell him, you are chayav misa. And the 10 Harugei Malchut are connected to 10 Shvatim, as it were. So obviously, Bechiras Yosef was an Aveira. But the Seporno is telling us a very interesting subtlety, which is something that we have to be aware of. In the mind of the brothers, at least initially, it was not an Aveira, because they convinced themselves that halachically, whatever the halacha meant in those days, halachically, there was a redifa, and they can do what they're doing. So they go to sleep at night, and they say, well, too bad we had to do it, but we had to do it. But in reality, what the Torah is saying is that the reason they perceived the halacha to be that way was because of jealousy and envy. It wasn't a conscious thing. I don't like this guy, so I'm gonna sell him into slavery. But rather, the jealousy and envy changes your perception of reality, so that you literally convince yourself this is the right thing to do, when in point of fact it is an expression of vengeance and hate. Meaning, this porno is telling us the brothers were better than simply acting consciously out of jealousy and hate. They acted because they had a logical process that compelled them to this result. But the logic was dictated by the emotion. The emotion causes you to see things a certain way, which may or may not correspond to the truth. And this really is a fundamental musar that we have to think about in our own lives. That often we convince ourselves of the rectitude of our decisions, when in fact the reason we see things a certain way. In fact, Rabbi Shul, Shiva Vorsamech, has a very cute thought experiment that he sometimes uses. He says, especially people, this is the time of year where we have visiting college students who come for a week or 2 weeks because it's still the intercession in the United States. So they challenge a lot. They say, I don't know, if I only knew the Torah is from God, I would accept it, but I really don't know. So Rabbi Shiller said, okay, what if we had 613 commandments that would say, you can do what you want, you can eat what you want, it's a mitzvah to have a good time. He says, somehow he feels you wouldn't be so bothered with the inadequacies of the philosophical proof. Meaning to say, it's not the objective problem that is bothering you. Rather, you're kind of inventing or thinking about these objective problems because the Torah is making certain demands that are not as pleasant to you as the alternative would be. If the Torah would have enshrined the playboy ethic, we'd have far fewer questions on Torah Min Hashamayim and the like. But okay. But be this it may, this is the Seporno's Mahalech, and again, it's an interesting food for thought. I think the primary lesson of this is that it really goes back and reflects on how we make decisions and how often we convince ourselves that we're seeing things objectively, when in point of fact there may be a fundamental bias in how we view things. But now let's look at it from Yosef's perspective. Yosef behaves in a way, perhaps you could understand it. After all, Yosef is justifiably very resentful or might be to his brothers, and he wants to, show them what it's like to be in danger, what it's like to be in prison. He recognizes them right away, but he doesn't reveal himself. He is the tough leader who accuses them of being a spy, and after hearing that there's one son left at home, which of course he knew anyway, he says, "Bring him to me, or you get no more food." And when they tell him that's going to kill our father, the actual nightmare that Yaakov was afraid of comes to pass. Binyamin is framed with the goblet of Yosef, and Binyamin is going to lose his freedom. So what's going on here? Even if Yosef is angry at his brothers, is he angry at his father? Is he angry at Benjamin, at Binyamin? Certainly not. And yet, look at who's suffering here. It's also Yaakov Avinu. It's also Binyamin. So there are three explanations I'm going to share with you relatively quickly. Explanation number one is the Ramban, which is actually the most famous explanation, but it's going to have a lot of problems. The Ramban understands that Yosef has a divine mandate, so he perceives, to ensure that his dreams are fulfilled. Yosef, as a 17-year-old, had two dreams that indicated that his brothers and his father and mother would bow down and acknowledge him as a king. He had the dream of the sheaves bowing down, the 11 sheaves, and he has a dream of the 11 stars and the sun and the moon. The sun is the father, Yaakov. The moon is the mother, and although in a literal sense it couldn't be Yosef's actual mother because Rachel had already died, but nevertheless, after Rachel died, Bilhah, that was Rachel's concubine, was the substitute mother. I was going to say surrogate mother, but now you can't use that term because that was co-opted by Isha Pundakait, so we can't, just like gay used to mean happy. Does anyone remember that? Okay, no longer. Okay, so we've lost that word. So Bilhah is the substitute mother, the surrogate mother, the stepmother, whatever it would be. Now Yosef sees this as a divine mandate. If Yosef were to reveal himself to his brothers at the outset, there would be a reunion. They would hug, they would kiss, they would be friends. But they have not yet acknowledged him as a king. Therefore he cannot reveal himself, so they prostrate themselves. But there's only 10 of them. He has to have Binyamin as well, because the Chalomot were 11. So he brings Binyamin. He demands that they bring Binyamin. That's Act 2, right? Act 1 is making the brothers be subordinate to him. Act 2 is getting Binyamin to be subordinate to him. But then there's an Act 3, but the play didn't get complete. The idea of framing Binyamin and taking Binyamin as a prisoner was designed to get Yaakov down to Mitzrayim, not yet knowing that Yosef is his son. And Yosef was hoping that Yaakov would beg for Binyamin's life. And that would have been, the Ramban says, the final fulfillment of Yosef's dreams. And at that point, Yosef would have revealed himself because the play would be over. What happened was, the Ramban says, Yosef did not complete his own self-defined mission because by virtue of Yehuda's Mesirat Nefesh to take Binyamin's place, Yosef broke down. And therefore the final fulfillment of his dream did not quite happen, but it is pointed out that when Yaakov summons Yosef this week to tell him, don't bury me in Mitzrayim, bury me in Eretz Yisrael, it does say that Yaakov bowed down to Yosef in gratitude. So that was the final step. Now this is what the Ramban says, that the whole behavior of Yosef was to orchestrate the fulfillment of his chalomot. The Abarbanel again is a very, very famous biblical commentator. Many of you probably know. The Abarbanel was also the finance minister of Spain during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, and this was during the Spanish Inquisition. And although every Jew had to either convert to Catholicism or leave the Abarbanel because he was the money man Ferdinand was willing to give him a one-man exception. Rabbi was permitted to remain in Spain and even be a Torah-observant Jew, but the Rabbi did not accept the offer. He went in 1492. He went with everybody else, and then he went to Portugal. Then he went to Italy, etc. It's interesting that the Rabbi was the elder, was the leader of the Jews in Spain, and among the thousands of people who left Spain on the 9th of Av, 1492, was a 4-year-old boy with his mother, and that 4-year-old boy was Rav Yosef Karo, the one who eventually wrote the Shulchan Aruch, who went first to Turkey and then to Tzfat. So it's interesting, the Abarbanel is at the head of the procession in his 70s, and Rav Yosef Karo, it is recorded, was towards the tail end of the procession as a 4-year-old boy. But the Abarbanel, in fact, Abarbanel was the one who financed, who arranged the financing for Columbus's expedition to what turned out to be the New World, although they thought they were going to India, kind of a shortcut to India. But be it as it may, as gifted a financier as the Abarbanel was, his true claim to fame are his commentaries on the Chumash and on Nevi'im and some Ksuvim as well. And the Abarbanel questions the Ramban's thesis very strongly. Even if we assume that Yosef had the right to make a determination that these dreams are a form of prophecy, which perhaps we couldn't do, but let's say Yosef has the credentials to determine this as a prophecy. A prophecy is not a command per se. God did not say, "Thou shalt endeavor to be a king." God is simply showing him what the future will hold. Now, the ends don't justify the means. If you feel that God is giving you a prophecy to be a king, does that give you the right to lie, cheat, hurt your parents, hurt your innocent brother, even take revenge against the brothers who hurt you? The Abarbanel says there's a real ends versus means type of problem here, meaning if God wants you to be king, you will be king one way or the other. Now, granted, you shouldn't do anything to frustrate that role, but where is your heter? It's like a mitzvah ba'avera. Where is your heter to do sinful actions that are immoral and unethical because you have a dream? So because of this, the Abarbanel does not accept Ramban's premise. And again, there's also something particularly humiliating, I think, about the concept that Yosef felt he had to bring Yaakov down to beg Yosef to free Binyamin. That in particular leaves a bit of a bad taste in our mouth, that was part of Yosef's original plan, that even Yaakov needed to be humiliated before I reveal myself to him. Right? So the Abarbanel does not like Ramban's thesis. So the Abarbanel offers an alternative explanation. And he focuses on a passage of the Rambam, Maimonides, in Hilchos Tshuva. Right? It's a very famous passage. Maimonides talks about, a person does tshuva, I regret my past, I resolve to be better in the future. But how does a person know? How do you know when your tshuva is complete or not complete? What is the test of tshuva gemura? So the Rambam says, you really never know unless and until you are confronted with the identical situation that caused you to fail. And you have the same Yetzer Hara and the same strength. So if you're 95 years old and you couldn't do this in any way, that's not the same. But you have the strength and you have the opportunity. And you turn yourself down. You turn it down. Now, what's the bad news about that is you're actually not allowed to test that proposition. Meaning, let's imagine that every time a person went to a certain neighborhood, he always did something wrong. He took drugs, he saw a prostitute, right? He just couldn't help it. The neighborhood attracted him. Now, he does tshuva. He never really knows as if his tshuva is complete until he goes back to that same neighborhood and doesn't succumb. But halachically, he's not allowed to go back to that same neighborhood, because what gives him the right to make the assumption that he is so strong? An alcoholic. We could talk about an alcoholic. An alcoholic does tshuva, whether through a 12-step program or whatever it is. Now, ideally, if the tshuva was totally complete, He should be able to go into a bar, watch other people drink, and just say no. Again, Nancy Reagan. And in fact, if there's the highest level of tshuva, he should even be able to take a drink and then stop after one. Then he's really changed. But as every alcoholic will tell you, that is the most dangerous thing to do in the world. Don't do it. Don't go into the bar. Certainly don't take a drink. So, in a sense, we are fated to go through life never really knowing if our tshuva is complete. Unless, we just fell into a situation. Then we might know. But you're not allowed to seek out. That's called putting yourself in a nisayon. And as Pirkei Avot says, Al tamin bi'atzmecha ad yom motecha. It's good to have self-esteem. It's good to have self-confidence. But don't have total trust in yourself until the very, very last moment. But this is tshuva gemura. So says the Abarbanel, Yosef is not interested in orchestrating his dreams, but he is interested in ensuring that his brothers have done tshuva for what they did. Now, what was the sin of the brothers? The sin of the brothers was jealousy and hate because of the favoritism that Yaakov showed Rachel's child over Leah's children and the other children. And this was a favoritism that grated at them. Probably, I would venture to say, it was also connected to the idea that they felt their mother was being rejected. And it wasn't just that they weren't treated as good. But I'm sure there was a certain element of feeling for their mother, who in many ways, Leah's sense of rejection is pretty strong, pretty palpable. All the children she names are connected, at least the first 4 children, are connected to that sense. Oh, God has seen my suffering and now my husband will love me. God has heard my pain. Now my husband will be with me. You get this recurring sense that although I cannot believe, even though the Torah says, and Yaakov, hated Leah, I cannot believe that this was hate in the way we understand it. Just maybe in a relative sense. But there is no question that Leah felt a very, very strong sense of this pirud. So the brothers have a tremendous jealousy for the favoritism that Yaakov showed B'nai Rachel over B'nai Leah. But now they must do tshuva. And the tshuva would be, have they overcome that hatred? Are they willing not only to love the child of Rachel, but are they willing to sacrifice their own life so that Yaakov will have the child of Rachel that he loves the most? That's Binyamin. So Yosef indeed intended. He actually wanted. In other words, instead of looking at Yehuda's speech as interfering with Yosef's plan, right? The Ramban says that cut it short because Yosef wanted Yaakov to come. It's the other way around. This is exactly what Yosef wanted to see. Will the leader of Leah's children stand up and say, I will give my life, I will give my freedom so that this child will go back to his father. And therefore, Yosef revealed himself. See, according to Barbanel, Yosef did not reveal himself prematurely. Exactly what needed to be accomplished was accomplished. And that is, the Barbanel views Yosef's behavior as a facilitation of the tshuva gemura that the brothers must undergo. But even on the Abarbanel, there is a question. In fact, one might ask on the Abarbanel the very same question the Abarbanel asked on the Ramban. Is this really Yosef's business? The brothers committed an awful sin, a sin of jealousy, a sin of sinah. They must do tshuva to be sure, and indeed they must ask Yosef's forgiveness at some point. But does that give Yosef the dispensation? That kind of thing. You're going to do tshuva even if I have to kill you. I mean, you can't, as it were, say, I'm going to do immoral, unethical, cruel behaviors to make you do tshuva, including hurting my father and including hurting my innocent brother. But I'm going to get you guys to do tshuva. Once again, you're back to this fundamental problem. Is it Yosef's business to force a tshuva onto his brothers if that involves all of this negative behavior? Again, mitzvah haba ba'aveira. So here, we need to expand in the Abrabanel a little bit. That is, what is going on here is not simply 10 people did something bad to one person. If it would simply be a matter of you 10 people grievously hurt me, and therefore I'm going to manipulate you to see if you did tshuva, we would indeed raise a legitimate question. What gives Yosef the right to do that? But there's a much more cosmic process that's going on here. Yosef is contemplating the fundamental improbability of his life. Yosef's life trajectory makes no sense rationally. The very fact that he was sold into slavery by his brethren really makes no sense. I mean, how is that going to happen anyway? The fact that he's taken to Egypt, he starts off as a slave, he rises to be the head of a household, he languishes in prison for 12 years. He becomes, through the talent of dream interpretation, the most powerful person, maybe short of Paro, in Mitzrayim. And in some ways he was more powerful than Paro. He was actually kind of like Mike Pence is going to be running the United States government much more than Donald Trump, probably, and the like, which, might be a good thing. But anyway, and of course Yosef is not only the powerhouse of Egypt, he's really the powerhouse of the whole region, because you see that there's a famine in Eretz Yisrael as well, other countries. It doesn't make sense. If you would pitch this as a Hollywood script, as a rags to riches story, the producer would say, not realistic enough. But it happened. And if it happened, there has to, and then of course Yosef also connects it to his dreams. So there must be a purpose here. There must be a mission. There must be a reason why God put me on. Yosef tells his brothers that. He says, you intended to hurt and harm me. But everything you intended turned into a vehicle of good. Which, by the way, raises intriguing theological questions about the interaction between free will and a so-called divine plan. Because one thing is for sure, the brothers had free will to exercise a decision to sell Yosef or not. That is a moral decision, and on that we say, Hakol b'dei Shemayim, everything is in the hands of heaven, except the decision to obey God in a good way or a bad way. And yet, along with the free will to sell Yosef or not sell Yosef, God had a plan that Yosef would rise to Malchus. What would have happened had they not decided to sell him? How would God... In other words, that wouldn't have changed the end result. It would just have to be achieved another way. This is a fascinating minuet, meaning Hashem has a predetermined plan. But how that plan gets carried out depends on billions, trillions of decisions of individual autonomous actors. And Reb Tzadok of Lublin develops the very controversial theme. In fact, it's so controversial that there are passages in Reb Tzadok's Sforim that were edited out because they were thought to be too explosive for the Orthodox Jewish world. But Reb Tzadok was a great gadol. In which Reb Tzadok even says by sins, you're not supposed to do sins, but if l'maaseh you did, it must have been God's will on some level, because nothing would have happened had it not been God's will, and therefore there is something that comes out of it. Again, one needs to think about what that means. But Yosef is looking, I have a purpose. There's a reason why I'm here. Now, the truth of the matter is, each of us should look at our life to try to identify why we're here. But in Yosef's case, it was so obvious that there was something unusual about his life, that there was a divine reason why he's placed here. And this is how Yosef defined his purpose. Yosef understands that the galut that was prophesied to Abraham, Kiger Yiya Zaracha B'Eretz Lo Lahem. Now, in that prophecy, Egypt was not mentioned. Egypt was not mentioned. It could have been anywhere. But Yosef now understands. This is where it starts. This is a galut. And Yosef understands that this galut is going to be bitter, oppressive, destructive. And it is Yosef's divine mandate to prepare the future nation of Israel with all that it needs to be able to withstand the destructive features of the galut. Now you see this in many aspects of Yosef's life. First of all, in galut there are two types of dangers that we face. We face the dangers of persecution, affliction, poverty, oppression. Yosef was a slave. He was a prisoner. We also face another nisayon in countries of affluence in Western civilization. We face what is perhaps even a greater nisayon of affluence, power, prestige. When there is power, power corrupts, as Lord Acton said, right? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power empowers and enables assimilation. So Yosef encapsulates in his life the extremes of poverty and deprivation with the other extreme of power and wealth. And even in the middle of the most decadent culture in the world, Mitzrayim, he preserves his moral compass. That is an eternal lesson for us. A role model, so to speak. Surviving galut, no matter which nisayon we have. The nisayon of persecution. Lubavitcher Rabbi used to say, it was easier to be frum in Siberia than suburbia. And of course he had lived, he never lived in suburbia, but okay, but he lived in Siberia, and the Lubavitcher Rabbi of Nachum Mendel I guess Crown Heights is not suburbia, but whatever it is. But the general point he made is that sometimes it is easier to serve Hashem under persecution conditions than it is under affluence. And that's what the Torah itself says. The Torah itself warns us. Vayishman Yeshuvun Vayivat. You'll come to Eretz Yisrael, you'll be successful, and you will reject God. You will kick at Hashem. So Yosef's life shows us those extremes. But here's a further point. We know that the Jewish people remained enslaved in Mitzrayim for 210 years. Actually, the actual enslavement was less than 100 years, but from the time Yaakov came to Mitzrayim until we left Mitzrayim is 210 years. We know that during that time, our sages teach us there was actually tremendous assimilation in some ways. Most of the Jews, except for the tribe of Levi, were idol worshippers. Most of the Jews, except for the tribe of Levi, did not practice Brit Milah. 4/5 of the Jews died in the Makkah of Choshech. And even the 1/5 that survived, we are told, this is from the Arizal, it's a well-known teaching, but it's not in the Gemara. This is a teaching of the Ari that everybody has heard. We were on the 49th level of impurity. There is only 50 levels. Once you hit level 50, you're gone. You're irredeemable. We were at level 49, and the Arizal says, when the Torah says we didn't have time to let our dough rise, it isn't, that's why we have to bake matzah and not have bread. And it only takes 18 minutes for the dough to rise enough to be chametz. The Ari says it wasn't Paro only that was kicking us out. It was Hashem basically saying, get out now. If you wait another 5 minutes, you're going to hit level 50. Now, I don't even know what that means exactly. But if they would have stayed another minute longer, it's level 50. Get out. So, We were, and that's the one. That's the 1/5 that survived. The 4/5 that didn't survive, they had hit level 50 already. So we were not in a great shape. We were not in good spiritual condition. The Gemara says in Sota, and the Medrash gives slightly different list, that in spite of the fact that we were so lowly, we had certain zechutim, certain merits that enabled our redemption. We didn't change our names. We didn't change our language. We spoke Lashon HaKodesh. According to one version of the Medrash, we didn't intermarry. We remained with Jewish women. We didn't speak Lashon Hara against each other, which actually means we didn't turn informers to the Egyptians to get advantages. As you know, even even in the Holocaust, there were occasional cases of Jews informing on other Jews. Again, they thought they would save their lives. Unfortunately, usually it didn't help them either. But that was not done in Mitzrayim. And that was the basis for redemption. Now let's think about it for a moment. Obviously, the Jews in Mitzrayim were not from in any meaningful sense. If they were worshiping idols, they were worshiping other gods. They were not practicing the religion of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So what's the big deal that he has a Hebrew name and speaks Hebrew? I mean, you have some guy in a bar in Tel Aviv who, doesn't keep anything, doesn't even say Shema Yisrael, and he wears a gold chain with the Magen David and his name Rafi. So that's somebody worthy of redemption? The answer is yeah, as a matter of fact. Certainly, it is not the end all and it's not the purpose. Yetziat Mitzrayim was clearly in order that we should receive Hashem's Torah and submit to the will of God. That's why I remember during the 1970s when there used to be the demonstrations on behalf of the Soviet Jews, the Jews in the former Soviet Union. So all the federations had a big sign in front of every show, "Let my people go." Now, first of all, that's not even an accurate translation. Shalach ami says, "Send my people." Okay, whatever it is. But the point is, they always left out the end of the pasuk. It says, "Shalach ami, send forth my people, v'yavduni, so they will serve me." Right? They left out that part. So certainly, the purpose of Yetziat Mitzrayim is to serve Hashem. But that redemption could not take place unless there was a sense of Achdut, of Avat Yisrael. What are these indicators? We kept our Jewish names. We spoke Lashon HaKodesh. We didn't intermarry. We didn't speak Lashon Hara. These were not from Kait. It's not that they learned Chafetz Chaim daily halacha and they didn't speak Lashon Hara. These are what you might pejoratively call ethnic identification. I looked at my fellow Jew and I said, these are my people. These are my family. I rejoice in their joys. I suffer in their sufferings. I don't know Torah. I don't know mitzvot. I worship idols even. But I identify myself as this is my nation. That is the beginning, not the end, but that is the beginning of redemption. Redemption comes, or redemption is made possible only when there is an achdut in which you identify with the fate of the Jewish people. You don't try to escape it. You become part of it. That's why in many, many ways, with all of the religious and philosophical questions one could raise about the political Zionist enterprise, going back to Theodor Herzl, and we can talk about that, and controversies arise to this very day. But the one thing which it does have very, very definitely is a sense of identification with the Jewish nation. It may not have had the Yavduni, so it may not have been the end result of what God wanted, but it did represent the root from which redemption would come. Without that Achdut, without that Avat Yisrael, we would have hit the 50th level. We would have been irredeemable. Now, the Avodah Yisrael didn't bring us to a very high level. It just kept us at 49.5 and sinking. But that is what kept us above the quicksand. Without that, there would have been nothing. So now, let's go back to Yosef. If Yosef understands that it is only Achdut and Avat Yisrael and a sense of Jewish peoplehood that will enable us to survive the Egyptian exile. And if Yosef understands that it's his God-given job, task in life, to give us the tools to survive that exile, then quite literally, Yosef cannot allow the exile to begin. The exile begins when Yaakov comes. That's the beginning. The Galut cannot begin until Yosef has ensured that the refuah is there before the Makkah. And therefore, going back to the Barbanel, if the issue of the 10 brothers was simply an issue of 10 people did something bad to one person, it may not have been Yosef's business to do all this. But Yosef cannot allow a galut to begin if there's still a vestige of the Sinat Chinam, because that would mean we're tainted from the beginning. And then it might become a cancer that, God forbid, would lead us to the Shar Nun, the 50th Shar. And therefore Yosef has to determine ahead of time that the Sinat Chinam has been eradicated by the selflessness of Yehuda. And at that point Yosef says, okay, now I can reveal myself. Now Yaakov can come down. Now the Galut can begin. Because we now have the mechanism by which we will be able to survive this Galut and not descend into Shar Nun. Right? So this is really an elaboration of the Barbanel, but looking at it in terms of a global, cosmic process instead of the specific grievances that one person has against 10 people. Now, the truth of the matter is that the Vilna Gaon is an interesting comment. The Vilna Gaon said, you know, we talk about 4 Galiyot, 4 exiles. They are Babylonian exile, which has lasted 70 years, and they destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash. Then we have the Persian exile, which according to our chronology is very short. That's the story of Purim. And then we have the period of Greek rule, Antiochus. And then we have the long, much longer than all of the Galiyot together, of Rome. Galut Edom, Rome is considered to be descendant from Esav. And although the Roman Empire is long gone, but number one, the Roman Empire is said to have been taken over by Christianity and Western civilization, and we are still in the Galut Edom. And other Midrashim speak about a 5th Galut, the Galut of Yishmael, the Acharit Hayamim. And you have to reconcile that with the notion of the 4 Galuyot. It's been suggested that Galut Yishmael is not a distinct Galut, because after all, most of us are not ruled by Yishmael, but rather it refers to the interaction of Yishmael and Esav, the Acharit Hayamim, which is the clash between Islam and Western civilization. So it's not a separate Galut, it is the final component of the last Galut. So in the Pizmon, in the Zemer, Ma'osur, right? So I'm sure all of you know and noticed that each stanza is devoted to a different Galut. We have the Galut Bavel and the Galut Paras and the Galut Yavan, and the last stanza is asking Hashem to redeem us from the Galut of Edom. But there's also a stanza, besides the first general stanza, Ma'osur, there's a stanza about Mitzrayim, Ra'ot, right, that's the Resh, Ra'ot Sava Nafshi. Now Mitzrayim is not described as a Galut. Mitzrayim is a pre-Galut, because we were not yet living in Eretz Yisrael as a nation. But the Vilna Gaon says, Mitzrayim is the prototype of all Galuyot. Meaning to say, what happened in Mitzrayim, in different aspects, reflects what will happen later in a much more intense and prolonged way. And therefore, If indeed the way we emerged from Mitzrayim and we didn't hit level 50 is only because we overcame Sinat Chinam and we had Avat Yisrael, so too the liberation from the last Galut will require that same thing. And this is obvious because Chazal say the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, and as Rav Kook used to say, it will only be rebuilt when we have Avat Chinam. That's a very, very interesting point. Josephus, who of course was a Jew, Yosef ben Matisyahu, not the Chanukah Matisyahu, but Yosef ben Matisyahu HaKohen, was a Jewish man who was a Jewish leader of a military brigade who surrendered to the Romans for various reasons. And is he Benedict Arnold? Is he not? The jury is still out exactly about Josephus. But Josephus was an eyewitness from the Roman side to the destruction of the temple and the whole war against Rome. And he wrote about it. And he's not a 100% reliable witness because obviously he's writing it under the guidance, under the support and tutelage of Titus, the emperor himself. So he couldn't be too bad. So Titus is painted in a little bit more positive light than the rabbinic sources portray him. But there's one interesting thing that he quotes Titus as saying, and I suspect it may have the ring of truth. And that is, at some point he says Titus was musing whether he should destroy the temple. So, it's a beautiful building, maybe I shouldn't destroy it. And then Titus is quoted as saying, if I just wait around long enough, maybe I don't have to do anything, because the Jews will just destroy it themselves with all of their infighting. And Josephus actually describes that the rival factions in Yerushalayim, the Zealots versus other groups, they were shooting arrows against each other in the Beit HaMikdash, and the Kohanim were crawling under the arrows to bring the korbanot. Imagine this, in the Beit HaMikdash itself, we imagine that there would be gunshot from two sides of Jews that are fighting. So some of what we see today is, not new, unfortunately. On the other hand, it's also not old, meaning we still have it. And B'ezras Hashem, I think the lesson of Yosef and the lesson of the 49th level of impurity teaches us only with Avat Yisrael and Achdut and a sense of being identified with Klal Yisrael will have a go. Just to end with one little anecdote. I myself, I lived in Chicago years ago, and there used to be, there is in Chicago, Devon Avenue, if you know Chicago. Now, Devon Avenue used to be a totally Jewish street. Now it's mainly Indian. The Jewish neighborhood moved a little north, but in those days, everything on Devon was a Jewish store. So I remember on Devon Avenue there was a kosher-style delicatessen. Kosher-style, meaning it was treif, it was not kosher, called the Bagel. And I remember once walking after a show, walking past the Bagel, which was open on Shabbos, and there was a sign that said, for Saturday we will give cholent and a glass of wine for every order. So, as a yeshiva student, I walked by and I kind of, in my heart, I mocked it. I laughed at it. I said, "Oh, that's a wonderful thing. Treif wine, number one, right? Non-kosher wine probably because yayin stam yenam. Treif cholent. Somebody comes in on Shabbos, does business, handles money, eats treif. But they're going to have wine where they could, are they going to say Kiddush? But it reminds them of Kiddush in the shul, or Kiddush at Bubby and Zadie's. And cholent is gastronomic Judaism. It reminds them of whatever it is, something they had at their aunt's house, 50 years ago. So my reaction was instinctively, stupid, foolish, trivial, the typical preoccupation with superficial symbols of Jewish experience that have no transcendental meaning. But as I get older, I see more and more some meaning to those types of things. Because what does the person doesn't keep kosher, doesn't keep Shabbos, probably doesn't go to shul except maybe 3 days a year, maybe 2 days a year, maybe 1 day a year, part of Yom Kippur. But he wants to connect somehow. There's an inchoate yearning in his heart to be connected to Jewish history, to be connected to Jewish food. I mean, that means something too. And that is the type of stirring that enabled our forefathers to be redeemed in Mitzrayim. The sense of wanting to be connected to a Jewish people. Is it enough? Surely not. Is it the purpose of the Jewish people? Of course not. But is it a beginning? It is a beginning. And if it is a beginning, it has some value. It has some meaning. It has some purpose. And I cannot look askance at a Jew that wants to connect that way. Because there's something in their neshama that says, I want to publicly, somebody wears a Magen David, all sorts of things. I want to, I mean, it irritates me. A lot of times I'm walking, everybody's Jewish, it's not a problem, but let's say, you're in a place that doesn't have a lot of Jews. So people walk by you and say, hey, I'm a Jew too, And, I always find it kind of irritating. Why are you bothering me, But, okay, but that's me. That's a problem. I mean, in reality, the fact that the person wants to connect on whatever level actually says something. And that is how we got out of Mitzrayim. And that is how we will get out of the bitter gullus that we're still in. So, y'all have a good week and have a good Shabbos.